So you're working on an epic novel and you want to write a story with more than one main character. How do you do it? I'm going to tell you. Stay tuned. Right now. Here we go. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Other Epic Story vlog. This is the show where I talk about writing, editing, world building, tips and tricks, and apply it to my own work, which is an epic trilogy. If you're new to this channel and you want to learn more about this project, I got a link right up there for you. Don't forget to subscribe if any of this is helpful. How do you write a story with more than one main character? I have 3 tips for you today, so pay attention. The third one is gonna blow your mind. Just kidding, it's not gonna blow your mind. These are like writing tips. It's never like a mathematical equation that you solve or a science experiment. It's like, this makes sense now. Writing is always so subjective, so always keep that in mind, that any of these tips, they're just tips. All right, so first tip to writing a story with more than one main character. I'm mainly talking about novels here because I'm working on a novel myself, but I believe these tips can apply to maybe a longer piece of short fiction, maybe like a 10,000 word short fiction. If it's like 3,000 words, just have one character, maybe 2. Maybe they could like, 2 characters converging, and that's cool. All right, I went off the rails again. Okay, tip number 1, have one POV character in a scene or a chapter. Probably the best example of this is our man George R.R. Martin and the Song of Ice and Fire series. Take a look at any of those books and just flip to a chapter, and even though 100 different things are going on and characters are interacting with each other, and even in a scene where 2 POV characters are interacting with each other, we are only seeing the world through one of their eyes. So in a Jon Snow chapter, even though he's interacting with Tyrion, we are only seeing the world through Jon Snow's eyes. We are only understanding what his thoughts are, what he's doing. All of a sudden, if he leaves the room, we can't just switch over to Tyrion unless there is a proper transition. This brings me to tip number 2. Make sure your reader know which character they're following as soon as possible. A good example of how this could sort of trip your readers up is if you have 2 main characters in a scene or a chapter, and it's the beginning of it, and they're both there and they're both of the same gender, and suddenly you use the word he to start it off. That can be tricky because they're both he's, and they could read for maybe a paragraph or 2 and still not figure out, wait, which one is doing that thing. They'll eventually figure out because your readers are super smart people. However, it's always a good idea to just make it a little easier for them. They'll appreciate it. Everybody appreciate it. Storytelling doesn't always have to be some sort of Rubik's Cube that your reader has to solve. And just make it easy for them. And you want to make it easier for yourself too, which brings me to tip number 3. When you have a chapter where all your characters finally get together, you have to pick one main character, the ultimate main character for your story. And this is where you kind of define your whole book. Sure, there could be more than one storyline or plot happening within this whole epic novel that you built, but eventually you need to figure out who is the hero of the story. Sure, this character does not have to be like the hero of the story, but this character does have to be the eyes and the ears and the brain and the emotional. They have an emotional stake in all this event that is happening as well. This character should be the one to carry your readers when there's so many others in the scene as well. So those are my 3 tips to writing a story with more than one main character. And now to talk about what I've experienced when I was writing my story. So I do this a lot where I would just, when you're writing, it's easy to just jump around because you're just trying to get it on paper. And so what ended up happening is my first and third chapter, upon reading it again, I realized that I began the chapter with one character, and suddenly, as things unfolded, I switched perspective midway through. This happened in chapter 1, and this happened in chapter 3. Although I don't believe this is the wrong way of doing it, because as long as you're writing, you're always right. However, I do feel that having a character shift within my chapter does hurt the chapter as its own section of the piece. A tip I gave before is that a chapter should be able to be a standalone story. If you just find a chapter on the street, although a lot of backstory is unclear, you should be able to follow that little arc that happens within a chapter, and I think that's what makes a good chapter. And if you were to just start off with one character and suddenly segue into another, you have 2 incomplete stories in my mind. So having read the draft of my novel, and if you want to check that out as well, there's a link to it right up there where I'm doing a reading of my story, so you could follow along if you're curious about what I'm talking about here. I might do a little restructuring of everything, so I don't want to get carried away with all this character shifts and all that stuff. However, if let's just say I want to keep it exactly the way it is, I should add a section break. Take this excerpt, for example, in chapter 3, where I start off the story with my character Frank Elias, who is a boy sheriff that just inherited that job from his father. It begins with that, and then suddenly he's in a bar and he's sort of making his presence known. After he leaves, I stay in the setting of the bar and transition to another character, Aaron Delane, who happens to be just sitting there at the bar listening to the sheriff give that speech. What I can do is add a section break, also known as a dinkus. If you've ever read a novel and you notice sometimes within a chapter there's some stars or a symbol or an asterisk, that is apparently called a dinkus. I know, hilarious. So what I can do is add that dinkus or section break there and just break up the story. That makes it more clear to the reader that, okay, following another character now, hard stop, new character, without actually, starting a new chapter, which is a perfectly logical thing to do as well. Every time you switch character perspective, start a new chapter. So I mentioned a bit about restructuring my story, and now just thinking about having multiple characters, which I do. I have 3 main characters in my story, arguably 3 main characters. Right now what I'm doing is I'm just jumping between characters. There's no logical flow. I'm sort of one chapter about this character, one chapter about this character. Everybody gets equal time. Another way you could split up your story if you have more than one character is, instead of just jumping from one character to another character, it's by splitting it up by settings. And setting, I mean time or place. So if you have one whole part of your story happening in the past, have that happen first, and then after that's done, go into the present day, go into the future, however you want to do it. For mine, I think it makes a lot of sense. This is just an idea here, that the first part of my story takes place all on the farm of Jin. Bernard Barnwell's character, he could be the main character for that part. And the second part of my story can take place outside of Jin. So this is the North Bourbon character. These are the Frank Elias and his journey. That way we could follow a character's journey for a bit and not have it so fragmented. And that way we always know where we are within the story. And then the third part of my book, I could have the convergence. These characters all colliding together, and therefore once they all come together, I could just have one main character. Yeah. Woo! Writing. A lot of stuff to think about. I hope this video helped you. Maybe it confused you even more. Maybe it made you question how many people you keep around in your life. Maybe you have too many main characters in your life and it's time to separate it. Section break, and not try to have them all together at once and just overwhelm you. Wow, that's deep. I'm going to leave you with that little piece of truth. If you're interested in learning how to introduce your character in a story, I got a video right here for you. Please continue watching and I'll see you there. Peace. Namaste.